Snow fell thick and heavy through the December night as David Martinez drove home from another late shift at the construction site. Through his foggy windshield, he caught sight of three figures huddled by the roadside, a woman clutching two small children, all three shivering in thin clothing that offered no protection against the bitter Colorado cold. David hit the brakes, his heart clenching as he saw the two little girls, maybe 6 years old, their cheeks red and raw from the freezing wind. The woman looked at him with eyes that held both wariness and desperation. When David opened his car door and stepped out into the swirling snow, he had no idea that this single decision would completely transform the lives of both families forever. If you've ever wondered whether one act of kindness can truly change everything, share your thoughts below. David Martinez had learned about loss the hard way. At 42, he was raising his 8-year-old son Miguel alone in a small house on the outskirts of Denver, struggling to make ends meet as a handyman after losing his engineering job following his wife's death from cancer 2 years earlier. The house still felt too quiet without Maria's laughter, too empty without her warm presence filling every corner. David's days blended together in a routine of work, school pickup, dinner preparation, and bedtime stories, a cycle that kept him moving forward even when the loneliness threatened to swallow him whole. But David had Miguel, and that was enough reason to keep going, even when the bills piled up and the silence grew deafening during those long hours after his son fell asleep. That December night, as temperatures dropped to 10 below zero and weather reports warned of an incoming blizzard that would dump 2 feet of snow across the Front Range, David found himself face to face with a situation that reminded him of his own darkest hours. The woman standing by State Highway 285 was clearly military, her posture straight, her movements precise, even as she tried to shield her twin daughters from the wind that cut through their inadequate clothing like ice-cold knives. Sarah, as she reluctantly introduced herself after David's persistent offers of help, carried an old army duffel bag and spoke in the clipped, efficient manner of someone accustomed to giving and taking orders under pressure. When David offered help, Sarah's first instinct was to refuse with the automatic wariness of someone who had learned that accepting kindness often came with hidden costs. She insisted they were just waiting for the bus, that they would be fine, that they didn't need charity from strangers. But David knew better than to believe such obvious desperation masked as independence. Buses didn't run during blizzard warnings, and even if they did, no 6-year-old should be standing in sub-zero temperatures wearing nothing but thin jackets and worn sneakers that had holes where young toes pushed against fabric. The two little girls, Emma and Sophie, stood quietly beside their mother, their small hands red with cold but their voices still polite as they answered David's gentle questions with "yes, sir," and "no, sir," responses that spoke of military discipline instilled from an early age. As David helped Sarah lift Sophie into his truck, her small body trembling from more than just cold, he caught a glimpse of something that would haunt him for weeks to come. A small, dark tattoo on Sarah's wrist depicting a raven with the number 13 beneath it. When Sarah noticed his gaze, she quickly pulled her sleeve down, a flash of genuine fear crossing her features before she composed herself again with practiced efficiency. The drive to David's house was mostly silent, broken only by Miguel's excited chatter when they arrived home, and he discovered he had new playmates for the first time since his mother's funeral months earlier. That first night revealed volumes about Sarah's background and current mindset. She remained vigilant long after David had set up makeshift beds in the living room and left food and warm clothes for the family, positioning herself where she could watch both the front door and the windows with the trained observation skills of someone who expected trouble to arrive without warning. She didn't sleep, instead moving through the house with careful, silent steps that spoke of extensive military training and recent experience with situations where relaxing one's guard could mean death. Miguel, meanwhile, had immediately taken to Emma and Sophie with the generous heart that children possess naturally, sharing his toys and books without question, and asking David in whispers if the girls could stay for Christmas, which was still 3 weeks away. The next morning brought revelations about just how much Sarah had to offer beyond her obvious need for shelter and safety. She insisted on earning her keep, approaching household tasks with military efficiency and precision that transformed David's somewhat chaotic bachelor home into a model of organization and functionality. She repaired David's broken garage door with knowledge that went far beyond basic home maintenance, demonstrating familiarity with complex mechanical systems that suggested advanced technical training. She fixed a persistent leak in the kitchen sink that David had been putting off for months, reorganized their small pantry with the systematic approach of someone who understood the critical importance of resource management under adverse conditions, and even identified several electrical issues that could have become dangerous if left unaddressed. Emma and Sophie began to blossom under the warmth and security of David's home, their quiet military politeness gradually giving way to the natural exuberance of children who felt safe enough to simply be kids without constantly monitoring their surroundings for potential threats. They helped Miguel with his homework, their advanced reading skills suggesting excellent education despite their recent homelessness, played elaborate games of make-believe in the living room that filled the house with laughter for the first time in months, and listened with wide eyes as David told them stories about Miguel's mother, Maria, and how she used to bake cookies shaped like stars every Sunday after church, while singing off-key Spanish lullabies that made everyone smile. But even as the household settled into a comfortable rhythm that felt almost natural, David noticed things about Sarah that troubled him deeply and suggested a past filled with violence and trauma. She startled at unexpected sounds, the backfire of a neighbor's car, the slam of a door, even Miguel's sudden laughter from the next room, with reactions that were far too quick and defensive for someone whose military service had ended in normal circumstances. She had scars on her arms and shoulders that looked suspiciously like bullet wounds, old injuries that had healed but left permanent reminders of close calls with death. Sometimes she would stand at the kitchen window for long minutes, scanning the street with the focused attention of someone expecting trouble to materialize at any moment. The breakthrough in their relationship came during a conversation late one evening, after the children had gone to bed and the house had settled into the peaceful quiet that David had once found oppressive but now treasured as a sign of his family's safety and contentment. Sarah found David sitting at the kitchen table, going through bills and looking overwhelmed by the financial strain of supporting 5 people on a handyman's unpredictable income. Without asking permission, she began helping him organize the papers, suggesting ways to prioritize payments and stretch resources with advice that came from someone who understood what it meant to survive on very little while keeping dependents safe and fed. When David thanked her for the help and expressed amazement at her practical knowledge, Sarah's carefully composed facade cracked just slightly, revealing glimpses of the pain and self-doubt that drove her constant vigilance. She told him that she didn't deserve his kindness, that he didn't understand what kind of person she really was, that accepting his generosity made her feel like a fraud who was taking advantage of a good man's compassionate nature. David responded with the gentle firmness that had gotten him through his own darkest days after Maria's death, drawing on reserves of empathy that came from intimate knowledge of loss and desperation. Everyone deserved family, he told her. Everyone deserved to be loved and to feel safe. But Sarah's response carried a weight that made David's heart ache for her, suggesting that whatever had happened in her past had convinced her that happiness was something other people deserved but not her. As days turned into weeks, the Martinez house transformed in ways that surprised everyone who lived there. Laughter returned to rooms that had been silent too long, filling spaces that had echoed with loneliness and grief since Maria's death. Miguel thrived having siblings to care for, taking his role as big brother seriously, and teaching Emma and Sophie everything from how to tie their shoes properly to the best spots in the backyard for building snow forts that could withstand the neighborhood kids' snowball attacks. David found himself cooking larger meals without thinking about it, buying extra winter clothes without question, and discovering that his heart had somehow expanded to encompass 2 more children who called him Mr. David with increasing affection and trust. Sarah, meanwhile, began to show glimpses of the woman she might have been in different circumstances, moments when her military bearing relaxed enough to reveal someone capable of tenderness and joy. She taught Miguel practical skills with the patience of a natural instructor, showing him how to tie military-grade knots and explaining that attention to small details could sometimes save lives in ways that might not be immediately obvious. When David taught Emma and Sophie his wife's secret recipe for star-shaped cookies, complete with the story of how Maria had learned it from her grandmother in Mexico, Sarah watched with an expression of wonder, as if she was witnessing something miraculous in the simple act of a father sharing cherished memories with his children. The evening that changed everything began like any other, with the kind of peaceful domesticity that had become their new normal. The 5 of them were crowded onto David's old couch, watching a Disney movie that had Emma and Sophie giggling at every joke, while Miguel tried to maintain his 8-year-old dignity by pretending he was too mature for cartoons. Sophie had fallen asleep against David's shoulder, her small body completely relaxed in a way that spoke of absolute trust and security. For a moment, everything felt perfectly, beautifully normal, the kind of scene that David had thought he would never experience again after Maria's death. That was when Sarah whispered her gratitude, telling David that he had given her daughters something she had never been able to provide on her own, the knowledge of what it felt like to have a real family, complete with traditions and inside jokes and the comfortable chaos that came with people who loved each other unconditionally. But beneath the growing warmth and connection, secrets were building pressure like water behind a dam that was already showing stress fractures. Sarah received phone calls that she always took outside, speaking in code that David couldn't understand but that left her tense and worried for hours afterward, pacing the house like a caged animal until she could force herself to appear calm for the children's sake. She had nightmares that woke her with silent gasps, though she tried to muffle any sound that might disturb the sleeping children or alert David to the extent of her psychological trauma. And there was that tattoo, the raven with the number 13, that she kept carefully hidden beneath long sleeves even when working in the warm kitchen during meal preparation. David's discovery of the truth came by accident, the way life-changing revelations often do when people are trying too hard to keep secrets that are too big to contain indefinitely. While helping Sarah move some of her belongings to a more permanent spot in the guest room, a gesture that had filled him with hope about their future together, a small photograph fell from her old army duffel bag and landed face up on the hardwood floor. The image showed 13 soldiers in full combat gear, all of them bearing the same distinctive raven tattoo that Sarah carried like a brand. On the back, someone had written Nightfall Team Alpha, brothers and sisters forever, in fading ink that spoke of age and careful preservation. When Sarah saw the photograph in David's hands, the color drained from her face so completely that he thought she might faint. She tried to snatch it back with desperate urgency, but David had already seen too much, already begun to process the implications of what he was looking at. His internet search that night, conducted after Sarah had retreated to her room with the kind of strained silence that preceded either explanation or departure, revealed the official story of Operation Nightfall, a classified mission from 2019 in which 13 American soldiers had allegedly died in an ambush while attempting to rescue hostages in Syria. According to military records that had been partially declassified following congressional pressure, there were no survivors from the team that had been sent into what turned out to be a carefully orchestrated trap. Yet Sarah was very much alive, living under an assumed identity with 2 children who weren't biologically hers, carrying the psychological weight of secrets that could apparently get people killed. When David confronted her with what he had learned, approaching the conversation with the careful gentleness he might use with a wounded animal, Sarah's carefully constructed composure finally shattered completely. Through tears and broken sentences that came in fits and starts, she told him the truth about Nightfall, how she had been ordered to retreat with classified information while her 12 teammates held off enemy forces, how she had wanted desperately to go back for them, but had been commanded by superior officers to prioritize the mission over the lives of people she considered family. Emma and Sophie, she revealed in a voice barely above a whisper, were the daughters of Marcus Thompson, her closest friend on the team and a man who had died protecting her escape route during the final, chaotic minutes of the operation. Before the mission had gone catastrophically wrong, Marcus had made Sarah promise that if anything happened to him, she would care for his twins, as if they were her own children, ensuring that they would grow up knowing they were loved even if their father couldn't be there to show them himself. She had been living with that promise and the crushing guilt of being the only survivor for more than 3 years, existing in a state of constant vigilance and self-recrimination that made every moment of happiness feel like a betrayal of the dead. But even as Sarah shared her deepest pain with someone who had earned the right to know the truth, new dangers were circling closer to the peaceful life they had built together. David had noticed the same dark sedan parked across from their house for 3 consecutive days, its occupants taking turns watching their front door with the patient, professional attention of people being paid to observe and wait for the right moment to act. When he mentioned this observation to Sarah, her reaction told him everything he needed to know about how serious their situation had become and how much danger his decision to help her had brought into his son's life. Sarah explained about Shadow Division, a black ops organization that operated in the gray areas between official military action and outright criminal enterprise, accountable to no oversight committee and funded through channels that didn't appear in any government budget. This organization had been responsible for the betrayal that led to the Nightfall massacre, orchestrating what appeared to be a rescue mission but was actually an elaborate setup designed to eliminate witnesses to their illegal activities. The mission hadn't failed due to enemy action or intelligence failures. It had been sabotaged from within to cover up an arms-dealing operation that went all the way to the highest levels of military and political leadership, generating millions in illegal profits while putting American soldiers at unnecessary risk. Sarah, Marcus, and one other soldier named James Rodriguez were the only witnesses to evidence that could bring down powerful people whose careers and freedom depended on keeping the truth about Shadow Division buried forever. This meant they had to be eliminated along with anyone who might have learned their secrets or could connect them to their new identities. David's internet searches about Nightfall, innocent though they were, had triggered monitoring systems that alerted Shadow Division to Sarah's location after months of unsuccessful hunting. The decision to leave came suddenly, born of Sarah's desperate need to protect the family that had become everything to her in ways she had never expected when she first accepted David's offer of shelter. She packed their few belongings in the middle of the night, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to disappear without leaving traces that could be followed by people with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. But Emma and Sophie woke up during the preparations, and their tears and confused questions nearly broke Sarah's resolve to do what she knew was necessary for everyone's survival. 6-year-old Emma asked why they had to leave Daddy David when they had just started to feel safe for the first time in their short lives. Sophie clung to Miguel's favorite stuffed animal, the one he had given her on her first night in their house as a gesture of welcome and acceptance, and asked if they would ever see their new family again, or if this was like all the other times when they had to leave people behind. Miguel, awakened by the commotion and immediately understanding that something terrible was happening, hugged both girls tightly and made a promise that would echo in David's heart for weeks to come. He would find a way to bring them home, no matter how long it took or how difficult the journey became. David stood in the doorway as Sarah led her daughters out into another cold night, watching the 3 people who had brought joy and purpose back into his life disappear into darkness once again. Sarah's final words to him carried the weight of everything she couldn't say about love and sacrifice, and the terrible choices that life sometimes demanded from people who had already given more than their fair share. She thanked him for showing them what happiness could feel like, even if circumstances meant they couldn't keep it, and promised that she would never forget the man who had proved that good people still existed in a world that had shown her mostly violence and betrayal. The house felt impossibly empty after they left, echoing with memories that seemed to mock David's belief that he could provide safety for people whose past made them permanent targets. Miguel refused to eat meals at the kitchen table, where Emma and Sophie used to sit, their chairs still pulled out as if they might return at any moment, asking constantly when his new sisters were coming home and why Daddy couldn't just go find them and bring them back where they belonged. David tried to explain that some problems were too big for ordinary people to solve, that there were dangerous forces in the world that couldn't be fought with good intentions and determination, but his 8-year-old son looked at him with disappointment that cut deeper than any criticism from an adult ever could. David attempted to return to his normal routine, taking on repair jobs and maintenance contracts that had once provided structure and purpose to his days. But concentration eluded him completely as he found himself thinking about Sarah and the girls at the most unexpected moments. He made mistakes on simple jobs that he could normally complete without thinking, forgot appointments with clients who had counted on his reliability, and spent long hours staring out windows as if he could will Sarah and the girls to materialize on his doorstep through sheer force of longing. The logical part of his mind understood that she had made the only choice possible to protect everyone's safety, including Miguel's, but his heart couldn't accept that they were truly gone forever without any hope of reunion. Days blended into weeks as David struggled with a depression that felt different from the grief he had experienced after Maria's death. This was the anguish of knowing that somewhere, people he loved were in danger while he remained powerless to help them, cut off from any knowledge of their fate or whereabouts. Miguel's questions became less frequent but more pointed, asking why his father had given up looking for their family and whether David's love for them had been real if he wasn't willing to fight for it. The turning point came in the form of an anonymous email that arrived exactly 3 weeks after Sarah's departure, appearing in David's inbox like an answer to prayers he hadn't realized he was sending. The message contained no text, only a video file that had been recorded during the final hours of Operation Nightfall by a helmet camera that had somehow survived the massacre. As David watched the grainy footage with growing amazement and horror, he saw Sarah desperately trying to coordinate a rescue of her trapped teammates, only to be overruled by commanding officers who insisted she prioritize extracting classified intelligence over human lives. More importantly, the video revealed that Marcus Thompson and James Rodriguez had both survived the initial ambush, contrary to official reports that listed all 13 team members as killed in action during what was supposedly a failed rescue attempt. The final frames showed Marcus wounded but alive, recording a message in which he begged any future viewers to find Sarah and tell her that the team's deaths weren't her fault, that she had followed orders and saved lives by preserving evidence of Shadow Division's crimes that would someday bring justice for their fallen comrades. Armed with this new information and driven by hope for the first time in weeks, David began his own investigation into what had really happened during Nightfall and why Sarah believed herself to be responsible for a tragedy that had clearly been orchestrated by others. He learned that Shadow Division had been using legitimate military operations as cover for moving weapons to unauthorized buyers in conflict zones around the world, generating millions in illegal profits while putting American soldiers at unnecessary risk and undermining official foreign policy objectives. When Marcus, Sarah, and James discovered evidence of these activities during what they thought was a routine hostage rescue mission, they had been marked for elimination along with their entire team. The ambush that killed 10 soldiers hadn't been the result of intelligence failures or enemy action. It had been arranged by Shadow Division operatives who needed to silence witnesses before they could report what they had discovered about the organization's criminal activities. The anonymous email had come from James Rodriguez, who had been living underground for 3 years while gathering additional evidence against Shadow Division and trying to build a case that could bring down the entire organization. He had been attempting to contact Sarah to coordinate their testimony and ensure their mutual protection, but her deep cover identity had made her nearly impossible to locate through normal channels. David's internet searches about Nightfall had triggered monitoring systems that led James to reach out, hoping to find Sarah through the only normal life she had attempted to build since going into hiding. David's decision to help came easily, despite the obvious dangers involved and the potential consequences for Miguel if their plan went wrong. He contacted James through encrypted communication channels and learned that Sarah and the girls were hiding in a rundown motel outside Denver, constantly moving to stay ahead of Shadow Division operatives who were systematically searching every possible refuge. James had intelligence suggesting that the organization planned to eliminate all 3 survivors within the next 48 hours, using methods that would make their deaths appear accidental or the result of random criminal activity. Miguel's reaction to the plan surprised David with its maturity and determination. When his father explained that they were going to help rescue Sarah and the girls, risking their own safety to bring their family home, Miguel didn't ask about the risks or express fear about the dangerous people involved. Instead, he asked what he could do to help bring his family home, showing the same protective instincts and moral courage that David had always tried to model for him throughout their life together. The motel where Sarah had taken refuge was exactly the kind of place people went when they needed to become invisible, cheap, anonymous, and populated by individuals who had their own reasons for avoiding attention from law enforcement or other authorities. David and James arrived just as Shadow Division operatives were positioning themselves for what would have been a final assault designed to look like a robbery gone wrong, complete with evidence that would support a narrative of random violence rather than targeted assassination. David found Sarah in a ground-floor room with windows that had been covered by towels and furniture positioned to provide basic defensive positions, holding Emma and Sophie close while explaining in gentle terms that they might have to be very brave very soon. The reunion was intense but necessarily brief. There would be time for emotions and explanations later, after they had dealt with the immediate threat to everyone's safety. Sarah's relief at seeing David was matched by her fear that his presence meant he was now also marked for elimination by people who left no loose ends and considered civilian casualties an acceptable cost of protecting their operations. James had brought more than just tactical support and an extra gun. He carried evidence that would finally expose Shadow Division's crimes to the public and ensure that justice was served for the Nightfall team and countless other victims of the organization's activities. The proof included financial records showing millions in illegal arms sales, communication intercepts revealing the planned sabotage of the Syrian mission, and testimony from other survivors of similar operations who had been silenced through intimidation, bribery, or worse. The confrontation with Shadow Division operatives was swift but decisive, demonstrating what was possible when people who loved each other refused to give up without a fight. Sarah's military training combined with David's practical knowledge of construction sites and building layouts to create defensive advantages that their attackers hadn't anticipated or prepared for. James provided tactical coordination and superior firepower, while David used his handyman skills to turn everyday objects into effective deterrents and create escape routes that gave them crucial advantages in what could have been an impossible situation. But the real victory came when Sarah finally stopped running from her past and chose to stand and fight for her future, drawing on reserves of courage that had been buried under 3 years of guilt and self-recrimination. For too long, she had carried the burden of surviving when her teammates died, believing herself to be a coward who had abandoned people who depended on her. The evidence James brought proved that she had been a hero who followed orders and saved lives, including the lives of Marcus's children who now called her mom and depended on her for everything that made life worth living. The lead Shadow Division operative made a final attempt to intimidate them into silence, threatening to harm everyone David cared about if they proceeded with plans to go public with their evidence and testimony. But David's response came from the heart of a man who had already lost too much and wasn't willing to lose anything more, drawing on the same determination that had carried him through his wife's death and the challenges of single parenthood. He told the operative that they had forgotten something important. His family had reasons to fight that went far beyond mere survival, reasons that made them willing to risk everything to protect what they had built together. Sarah's transformation in that moment was remarkable to witness. The guilt and fear that had defined her existence for 3 years fell away like old clothing that no longer fit, replaced by the fierce determination of a soldier who finally understood that protecting her children meant ensuring that the truth about their father's sacrifice would never be buried or forgotten. She stood beside David and James, no longer running from her past, but ready to reclaim her future and build something lasting on the foundation of truth rather than secrets. Snow was falling gently outside the kitchen window, each flake catching the morning light like tiny crystals that sparkled before melting on contact with the warm glass. But this time the snow carried none of the desperate cold that had marked the night David first found Sarah and her daughters huddled by the roadside. 2 months had passed since the confrontation at the motel, and the small house that had once felt too empty now overflowed with the sounds of 3 children who had learned that family could be built on love and choice rather than just blood and circumstance. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, carefully reviewing Emma and Sophie's homework with the patience of a mother who had finally stopped looking over her shoulder for dangers that would never come again. Her eyes no longer carried the constant vigilance and barely controlled fear that had defined her existence for so long. Instead, there was a peace that she had never experienced during her years of running and hiding, a sense of belonging that came from knowing she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Miguel burst through the front door, his cheeks red from cold and his snow boots leaving wet prints on the hardwood floor, covered in snow from building an elaborate fort in the backyard with his sisters. His excited chatter about their architectural plans and defensive strategies filled the house with the kind of joyful noise that made David remember why he had fallen in love with the idea of family in the first place. The boy who had been too serious for too long after his mother's death had rediscovered the simple pleasure of being 8 years old, secure in the knowledge that his family was complete and permanent. David watched from the doorway as his wife, because that's what Sarah had become in every way that mattered, legally and emotionally and spiritually. Helped Sophie sound out difficult words in her reading assignment. The little girl who had once answered every question with military precision now giggled freely and asked endless questions about everything from why snow was white to whether they could adopt a puppy for Christmas and what kind of job she might want when she grew up. Emma looked up from her coloring book, where she was drawing their family as stick figures holding hands in front of their house, complete with a carefully rendered snow fort, and what appeared to be a dog that existed only in her imagination, but might someday become reality. When she asked if she could add Uncle James to the picture, Sarah smiled and nodded, understanding that their extended family now included the man whose evidence had finally brought justice for the Nightfall team and freed all 3 survivors to live openly again. The phone rang, and David glanced at the caller ID before answering with the relaxed confidence of someone who no longer feared unexpected contact from the outside world. James had become a regular presence in their lives, joining them for Sunday dinners and helping with home improvement projects that required an extra pair of hands or technical expertise that went beyond David's considerable but limited skills. His calls usually brought updates about the ongoing trials of Shadow Division members or news about benefits finally being awarded to families of soldiers who had died in operations that were no longer classified or hidden from public scrutiny. But this call was different, carrying news that would require Sarah to make another difficult decision about how much of her past she was willing to share with the world. James had been contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell the story of the Nightfall survivors, to ensure that Marcus Thompson and the other fallen team members would be remembered as heroes rather than casualties of failed missions or classified operations gone wrong. Sarah would need to decide whether she was ready to speak publicly about experiences that had remained secret for so long, knowing that such exposure would bring both recognition and unwanted attention from people who might not understand the complexities of military service and classified operations. David found Sarah sitting on their front porch after the call ended, watching Emma, Sophie, and Miguel play in the snow with the focused attention of someone who still couldn't quite believe that such simple happiness was real and permanent. When he sat beside her on the wooden bench that he had built last spring, she leaned against his shoulder with the natural ease of someone who had finally learned to accept comfort without expecting it to be taken away without warning. The question of whether to participate in the documentary represented more than just a decision about publicity or media exposure. It was about whether Sarah was ready to help other survivors find their way home from wars that had ended on paper but continued in their hearts and minds long after the shooting stopped. David told her that whatever she decided, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else since that snowy night when he had chosen to stop for 3 strangers by the side of the road and discovered that sometimes the best decisions are the ones that feel dangerous but right. Sarah looked at her daughters, who were teaching Miguel the finer points of snow angel construction, their laughter carrying on the cold air like music that could heal wounds no medicine could touch. She thought about Marcus, who had trusted her with the most precious parts of his life, and about the other families who might still be waiting for answers about loved ones who had disappeared into classified operations and never come home to the people who loved them. The decision, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. Sarah would tell their story, not for fame or recognition or personal gain, but to honor the memory of teammates who had died believing their sacrifice had meaning beyond the immediate tactical objectives of their final mission. She would speak for families who deserved to know the truth about how their sons and daughters had lived and died in service to their country, and she would do it surrounded by people who loved her enough to share both the burden and the healing that came with bringing secrets into the light. As evening approached and the children came inside for hot chocolate and stories, tracking snow and mud through the house with the cheerful carelessness of kids who knew they were home, David marveled at how much their lives had changed since that December night when he had made a simple choice to help strangers in need. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the voices of 5 people who had found in each other everything they had been missing without even realizing it was gone. But questions remained about what came next, about whether the peace they had built could withstand the attention that would come with Sarah's decision to go public with their story. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities that none of them could have imagined when they were still strangers to each other, still broken by losses that had seemed impossible to survive. Would the documentary bring the closure and recognition that Marcus and the other fallen soldiers deserved, or would it open old wounds that had finally begun to heal? If this story of healing and second chances has touched your heart, consider how one moment of compassion can ripple outward to transform multiple lives in ways that no one could predict or plan. What do you think the future holds for this family who found each other in the darkness and built something beautiful from broken pieces? Share your thoughts about whether love truly is strong enough to overcome any obstacle, and what you would do if you were in their position.